Today we'll be focusing on three elements. The first one is an introduction to discernment. How do we make decisions in the presence of God? The second part of the session today will be focused on consensus decision making. And the third part will be how do we choose leaders? How do we use discernment in that process? We're going to begin today with some prayer, and we're going to finish today with a theological reflection. This is a prayer that's been attributed to Francis Drake, but people aren't really sure if it was, but it's been around for a long time and it's been adapted and turned into modern English. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we dreamed too little, when we arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of things that we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity, and in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas where storms will show your mastery, where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push back the future in strength, courage, hope, and love. In the name of Christ, we pray.
So to have a little bit of a recap, previously we talked to the first two sessions, we talked about values, relationships, how important relationships are, about accountability, and the code of ethics for lay leaders came up in that as one thing, and structures, how you structure a good church council meeting. Now, where we're going today is to look a little bit closer at what happens inside those meetings, as well as how to discern who to invite in, and how you make those and other decisions together with God in mind, Christ at the center, and open to the Spirit, which makes decision-making in the church and discernment a little bit different from other places. So God in mind, Christ at the center, and open to the Spirit while we are making our decisions. So first of all, I want to tell you a story. It's a bit of a fairy tale, but it has really happened. And I'm sure that it's happened in some of your churches in one way or another. There were once two churches who, after a somewhat rocky and long history of geographical proximity and different church traditions, decided to amalgamate. And they did this after a lot of prayer and discernment meetings and the slow growing recognition that together they could do things they were no longer able to do on their own. In fact, that they could do far more than maybe they had been doing anyway. So some embraced this new state of affairs, but in others there was still hesitation. There was even some simmering resentment here and there, an attachment to how things had always been. They struggled to express those feelings of unease that lingered, and felt like the group Christians they all were, that with prayer and patience, they would certainly grow to overcome the discomfort and that it would all somehow just go away. Except that it didn't, at least for some. Now, there were two sets of tablecloths, one from the one church and one from the other. One checkered and one with flowers on it. So the difference was quite visible. It was left to the people on the coffee roster to decide which to use and when. A silent battle ensued, where people started to note how many times which tablecloths were put on the table, for what occasions. I don't think I need to say more. Some started to arrive early to church to make sure that it was their tablecloths on the table that morning. And some started to change them during the service. It was raised in church council, and they didn't know what to do. Nobody was sure who exactly the culprits were, or they weren't prepared to talk about it. So everybody went home to pray. One Sunday morning, at the early word, the question was raised with the children. What do you do in the playground if you can't decide whose game to play? And they came up with some wonderful solutions. Share was one, take turns, let the other go first, let go of what you're attached to and try to see it from the other person's point of view, alternate. There were many, many different ways that they could imagine going in that situation. And the sermon that day was on Philippians 2 and deeming others better than yourself. And love, of course, for the other and patience with those who struggle. And at morning tea, some people were a bit quieter than usual. Then another battle ensued. Suddenly, everyone wanted to make sure the cloths of the other church were put on the tables. Until one morning, the children were early and somebody asked them to decide what they liked that morning, the flowery or the checkered. And when they were asked for their preference, they decided to have both and to throw some of the white tablecloths that were reserved for special occasions in for good measure. The next church council meeting talked about what had happened and reflected on the lessons they had learned. And they prayed some more together. So that's a story from real church life. When we turn to the scriptures, there are stories about decision making there too. The ones that speak to me, I've put some on that speak to me, but there are a lot of others as well. I always like to read the stories about Abraham and Moses where they argue with God. So God makes a decision and Abraham and Moses both are recorded to talk God out of his decision and change it. Just indicating how discernment can be something that goes back and forth even between people and God. There is the story of the replacement for Judas in Acts 1, where after a lot of talk, they decide to organize a lottery because they can't quite decide who to choose. And then there's a little bit later in Acts, the Council of Jerusalem, where there's a lot of talk back and forth before the council actually happens, during the council, and even afterwards. And we've got plenty of proof, evidence of that in the letters of Paul as well, what happened during that time. So they were growing into that process of discernment and talking together and taking time for important and difficult decisions. So learning to discern as a church, how do we go about that? And I wonder in the small groups if we could talk about what you've learned so far about how that works. What has helped you and your church council grow in your discernment and discernment processes? And very practically, what is a good decision? And how would you know? How do you keep God in mind at all times when you're making those decisions in church council? Where did you find Christ beside you? Where were those moments where you went, oh, that was more than just us? And where have you seen the Spirit at work in your decision making and your work as church councils? So we're going into small groups now, and invite you to have a conversation about those questions, one or two or all of them. And then when you come back, just feed us back one or two comments that may be important to share with the whole group. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good conversation. Ross Haggard.
Yeah, hi. We, in our group, we talked about the importance of listening, obviously, but also discerning which decisions are really big that really require lots of listening and perhaps a lot of emotions being allowed time to let out, and those areas where they're perhaps short-term, very immediate areas to discern or make decisions on that really don't require that. So kind of a sifting process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Andrea Casey.
We felt that breaking for prayer during a session was something, well, certainly I learned from these sessions, and we've been trying that with our church council. I think that's very helpful, very important.
Great, thank you. Alison Clarkson.
We felt that sometimes in the middle of a discussion, you have to take a break and give people some time to perhaps consider, or even to defer a decision until the next meeting, or if necessary, call a meeting in between, so that people again have got time to consider what's been discussed and consider their own approach to it.
Yeah, thank you. Julie.
We discussed the importance of being open to other people's opinions and everything, and sometimes that we can go into church council maybe a little bit closeted in our own way, and we discussed the importance of being open to other people's ideas and giving people time to discuss those.
Yeah, thank you. Sam Menzies.
I just wanted to share that it's become very apparent that I've put a lot of questions and decisions to our church council that have, in my mind, required a very quick decision, a very quick turnaround, and may have actually placed the church council under a fair amount of pressure to get an answer quickly. And so for me, this is a learning around the importance of discernment and the importance of time to make a really strong and good decision as a team, as opposed to the business world of just having to get decisions made very quickly. So that's just a little learning that I'll take into future decision making, and perhaps prepare the church council a little bit better before the actual decision needs to be made.
Yeah, thank you.
In fairness, some of those decisions have not been have been called for by outside people, and they've had to be very quick, and special council meetings and so on. But you've always briefed us well.
Thank you. Reuben.
We sort of talked about the need for compromise and how you come to consensus. But one of the challenges I sort of raised, and we didn't really get a good answer, was that in the Uniting Church, we talk a lot about the Holy Spirit as a part of a discernment process. It's particularly talked about at assembly and synods and presbyteries, but also at church council level. But the challenge then comes when one person discerns that the Holy Spirit is telling them that, you know, there must be an organ for the rest of church services forever. And another person is discerning that the Holy Spirit is telling them that they should get a rock band. And so you're kind of just stuck with this, you know, aside from the fun example, you're stuck with this challenge that people are discerning a Holy Spirit. And how do you tell them, no, they're not? Just like, you know, it feels like a very tricky base to work with as part of decision making.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Anybody want to respond to that or make another comment? Jenny.
I shared this, and I think it's good to know is the personalities of all the people on council. And I can't remember the minister's name, but a long time ago we did a course with her, and Jenny someone, and she was from Synod at the time.
Jenny Burns. Maybe.
Yes, that's it. And understanding that, you know, some people are very creative but not very good with detail. Other people are excellent with detail. Just like in business, we understand different people's personalities. Everyone brings something to council, and sometimes there's the thinkers who will have to mull over, like someone said, and then there's other people, you know, who just like jump in and want to have their say. So understanding each other's personalities and being aware of them so that everyone is included, I think, is a really helpful thing for a good council.
Hi, yes, in the situation that was just described, I like the story of the Hindu story about the blind boys touching different parts of the elephant. And while they all disagreed on what an elephant was, they all had parts of the truth of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Thank you. Kay.
I was encouraged by my breakout group to speak, even though I felt I didn't have a very strong story. But one of our ministers encouraged us to allow time in our church council meetings for some alternative thinking. So instead of just business and how wonderful we've finished quickly, setting aside an hour for a wider topic that we could ponder and perhaps be led to think of more effective ways of working or projects that we might take on. And of course, it was very useful. We ended up with some wonderful projects and improvements just by allowing time.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Jenny or Tony? Duncan?
Just to reinforce what was just said about time and discernment. But the other thing was that one of our members talked about having a safe environment when you're making decisions, and working on creating a safe environment where you can have disagreement, but not dislocation. And that was something that if we're really listening to the Spirit, then you need to create a safe environment. That's how good decision making is made.
Thank you. Very important. Daphne?
Yeah, well, one of the points that came up in our group early on was that the importance of having a wide range of people from the congregation participating in decision making. I thought that was important.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, there will be more room for comments and conversation as we go on. So back to you, Duncan.
When the Uniting Church was formed in the 1960s, in the sense of preparation for becoming the Uniting Church, and then when it finally was constituted and people came together in 1977, its large meetings, assemblies and synod meetings tended to be led and featured educated white males, mostly older. And of course, we were all a lot younger then, so we're not talking about us, of course. But back then, if you had the skills of getting up to the microphone and speaking your mind, taking down the opposition, you were one of the stars of decision making. For a while, that people felt that wasn't right. It wasn't a great environment. And what Tony said before about a safe environment, people felt not sure about getting up to the microphone and speaking. So after a while, we had some thought put into how we might have a better approach to decision making. And so we developed an approach which said that we need to have an approach that says hearing all the voices, everybody at some point is able to speak into this environment rather than just 4 or 5 people who are eloquent and on their feet. We need to be paying attention to the skills of discerning together, of listening to the Spirit and allowing the Holy Spirit to be influencing and shaping our decision making. And in the same way, we need to be able to hold different points of view across the Uniting Church and yet maintain unity. I was at a workshop with some therapists and coaches, people looking at organizational change this last month, and they were stunned to hear about the way in which the Uniting Church is able to hold different ways of seeing the world together. And I explained that if we were going to have a notice board out the front of our churches for new people, we could have the sign that says, if you're looking for a church that everyone agrees on the same things, that everybody see things the same way, you're in the wrong place. But here you'll find people who see the world in remarkably different ways and yet find ways of working together. So that's part of what we wanted to find in our decision making. So we came up with a consensus decision making process that had 3 parts to it. 1, how do we ensure that people are talking about the same things, are well informed and are able to carefully craft decisions that take into account all the things that we need to know. And so in our information sessions, in our assemblies, and our setup meetings and presbytery meetings, and in many of our church council meetings, we hold this really important. And part of that is actually writing good reports, ensuring that people are able to reflect on what's important before they get to a meeting, rather than having to think on their feet. And then the chance to have some deliberation. Now, in large groups like assemblies and synods and presbytery meetings, there's usually a focus on table groups where people can have a smaller conversation, where people who might feel shy to speak in public are able to have their say around the table. And part of this is being able to hear more voices. And of course, in this situation, even then, some people find it difficult to speak and are waiting to be asked to speak. So that's a skill we need to learn. And then is decision making. Now, in the Westminster tradition, the parliamentary tradition, which has been used in many of our public meetings across Australia and across the world, we have this idea that we have a motion and we have a mover and a seconder, and we can move amendments, and then we vote on that, and we have a decision beforehand about how many votes will get across the line. So do we need to have 50% plus 1 or 66% plus 1? So that's a formal majority approach to decision making, which the Uniting Church still holds on to in some situations where we need to have formal decision making. But generally, we try to find another way of operating that gives much more focus and fluidity in the way we make our decisions. So we're going to try that out. Now, do people bring their blue and orange things with them? Are you ready for some fun to work with this? Great. I see Tony's got an orange and a few other people have got things. And if you haven't got something, don't worry. But we're going to try some things out here. Yep. Orange is warm and blue is cool. Okay. So orange is, if you hold up an orange thing, you're saying, I think this is all straightforward. Blue is, I'm not sure about that. And the white or yellow cards that we sometimes use is, hey, I've got a question about this. So since samples, we showed you the Church Council agenda recently, and they've been listening to the workshops that we've been running, and they've decided to shape up their agenda in a way that works for them. So let's have a look and see what they've got. Their meeting coming up, Friday, November the 6th, they've allowed 15 minutes to begin with devotions, and they've got one motion around the consent agenda before they go into their half-an-hour listening time around stories and the minister's report. Now, let's have a look at what their consent agenda includes. It includes the minutes of the Church Council meeting, and they've been sent out around beforehand. It includes the email decision that they made on the 18th of October, and there's an action log that they've updated already. And then they're going to receive and note the correspondence, a letter from Ian Firth, the Presbytery Secretary, and a letter from Cosmo Kramer from Friends, thanking him for his editing of funny videos in 2020. There's the Treasurer's report. They've already discussed the budget last time, and now they're going to take it to the congregation for decision, but they're approving it here. And they've also received the property report. They don't need to discuss it. It's all quite straightforward. The property team are going to contact all renting groups. So that's a decision. So there's a mixture of receiving reports, minutes, and straightforward decisions that they think are quite straightforward. So I'm going to put that now. You've seen the agenda and you're the Church Council. You're the St. Samples Church Council. Are we ready to make a decision? So let's get a sense of, are we okay with the consent agenda, the minutes, the reports, the action log, and we can be pretty quick with this because we need to know if we're all set. If there's any blue cards, we can seek through. All right, so you're ready to go? Okay, looking to see very quickly. And you can see on the screens there, if you're looking at the gallery view, very quickly, if there's anybody who's not sure about that. And look, we've made a very quick decision. So we've made 5 decisions in about 3 minutes. All right, so the consensus decision-making process relied, first of all, on having good reports and a well-constructed recommendation or proposal. So we don't have to actually word craft the decisions on the spot. The work's been done beforehand. So half an hour of work by the chair and the secretary beforehand, working with the chairs of those committees, has made this part of the process much more effective. All right, so now we're going to move on to the more complex part of the business. Here we are. So the minister's report, there's about 15 minutes to talk about what the minister's been learning about faith formation and some thoughts about giving people a break. But now here's the half an hour, and we're not going to spend half an hour now, but we're going to just put our toe in the water. And there's a report that some of you may have read beforehand that at the end of it says we should resolve to continue live streaming of services on Sunday mornings in the months of December 2020, January and February 2021, with up to 20 people present in the church building. And the second part of that proposal is to encourage a range of outdoor gatherings of the congregation through the summer months for relationship building and for learning and for prayer. And we've noticed that the government is encouraging us to think about this. So at the moment, you can have 10 people in public places, in public parks. You can have up to 20 people in the on the grounds of the church outdoors, and that's likely to increase as time goes on. So we've had some reports. So first of all, let's just check to see how people feel about this. First of all, we're going to use the cards now. So if you have an orange card, you're saying, well, look, that looks all straightforward. I'm happy with that. If you have a blue card, you may have a concern about something in these two proposals. And if you have a white piece of paper or a yellow card, you might want to ask a question or of clarification. You're not sure about whether you just need some information. So we're going to take the first one first, the continuing live streaming of services with up to 20 people present in the church building. And I'm going to stop the sharing. And now let's put your cards up there. Have you got orange or blue or white? And okay, that gives us, the person who's cheering, a very quick idea that, well, there's quite a lot of support. There's some people are not so sure about this, and there are some questions and comments. And so if you'd like to make a question or comment, what I suggest you do then is unmute yourself and you'd like to make a comment. So let's begin with Gary.
I presume this is assuming that the government will let us have more than 10 people in the church at once.
That's true. It's assuming that. Notice it says up to, and that's allowing for the likelihood that at some point we may even be allowed to have 50 people. But the worship committee are saying, well, let's just stick with 20 people because we know we can handle that because of the size of the room we're using. We want to make sure we have enough room for 1.5 meters between people. Okay, that's a good question, Gary. David?
I'm wondering about how we actually select the 20 people who want to be in. If there's more than 20 people rock up, how do we actually decide who gets in and who gets out, who's kept out? And there's a cause for concern there. How do we do that?
Yep. And that could take about 10 minutes to work through. Yes, thanks for that, David. Diane?
I'm wondering if what's the definition of a faith leader? Does it have to be the ordained minister, or can it be a children's worker? Can it be an elder? Can it be somebody else who's just leading that day's prayers or worship?
Yes, indeed. And the understanding from what I can, we had a session yesterday with David Herbert from Synod, and we asked that question too. And his advice was if people are normally delegated and given opportunity to lead worship, we should continue with that process. So in the Uniting Church, that means we don't rely on ordained ministers to do that, which of course links in with the Kerry in the minister's report was saying we do need to give people a break, including Kerry, and also in the worship committee they were saying we need to roster things in a way that not just retired ministers and ministers, but also other people can lead worship. Diane?
Thank you.
Yep. So yes, Ennis?
I'm just wondering whether or not St Samples has got the not just the wherewithal, the physical resources to do it, but whether they've actually got the people resources as well.
Yeah. Okay. And part of that is that they're developing a fairly simple approach through the summer around their live streaming. So they're just using an iPhone and FaceTime. So that's what they've decided to do. Whereas some other churches are aware, have invested in a lot in different technology that requires a team of 5 or 6 people. So in this case, they've decided that they're going to keep it simple. All right, so these are great questions. Jenny and Tony?
My question was, have they really worked through a COVID-safe plan to open up?
Right.
I know all of the implications.
Okay, so these are the questions that the Church Council should be asking, and that's why we've allocated a whole half an hour to this discussion in the Church Council. And the use of the cards up to now, first of all, gives a sense of where people are feeling, and we can do it again. We can say, right, so how are people, now we've answered all those questions, we've worked those things out, are we happy to go with that? How do you feel about that now? And let's try that. Let's say we've answered all those questions, we've had 25 minutes of discussion on these issues, and let's try that. Alrighty, so that's good. We've got some orange cards and we've got some blue cards. Now we can just test this out first of all. Would anybody who's holding up a blue card, we're not afraid of blue cards because they help us make better decisions, all right? So blue cards are not just about being difficult, they're actually helping us carry a responsibility of governance well, unless of course, some people can use them as a tool of abuse, but generally this is about making better decisions. So would anyone like to speak to a blue card still? Tony? Or David Heim?
Yeah, well, I still feel that we should wait until everybody who wants to be in the worship can be in the worship, and limiting the number to 20 and restricting some people out and keeping them out is not a good position.
Yep. And yes, and that would make sense for a congregation who have 25 members, for sure. Yes. So, all right, so we're going to test this out. So we've had most people who put up orange cards. Would those people with blue cards accept that overall, this is the decision that we've come to, that generally most of the people in the room have said this should work. We can find a way of making this work. Would those people with blue cards like to say, well, that wasn't my personal view, but I see that this is the way we're going together and I'm going to support that. Would anyone like to speak to that? David, yes, you're putting up an orange card. You're happy to work with that.
Oh,
right. And Ennis?
No, orange.
Orange, yes. Okay, so you're supporting that as well. Okay, so so what we have come to is we've got consensus that we said we're, as a whole church council.
And we've still got Daphne with a blue card up there somewhere, I think.
All right. Well, that's a difficulty with having two screens here. All right, Daphne, do you want to say more?
I'm just wondering if the people who are running the service are part of the 20, or the people who are doing the operating the cameras and things.
Yes, they are. Yes,
they are. So yes. If you've got 5 people in a team, yep, then you've only got 15 who can come to church.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's 20 right. Plus 1. So if you've got 5 people, including the person leading worship, that's 16 people. So yes, it's not a lot. It's really a token congregation, but it means that you can do some more things in a worship service that you couldn't do with 5 people. Yeah. So so I think Ennis and David suggested that. So that's the approach. Now, if we had to, we could say move to formal majority. We could actually say we're going to have a formal process with a mover and a seconder, and we'll record the votes. So that's where we could go with if we really needed to move. But the other question is, do we need to decide today, or do we wait until we go to the 4:30 briefing session this afternoon with the Presbytery and get some more information, and then we can come back and have another conversation around this? How does that sound? James thinks it's a great idea, and David does as well. There's a few of us who are saying, all right, let's take some more time on this. We don't have to make a decision right now.
That was a good ad.
Thank you, Tony. All right, so that's the consensus decision-making process, that where we have a range of ways of operating. And of course, in a large group like this, we would spend half an hour, maybe in small groups where we can have some more conversation and everybody gets a chance to think things through and be heard, and then we can report back. And of course, very difficult decisions like the synod had to deal with in terms of voluntary assisted dying. We had to spend 2 or 3 days in different sessions coming back and are we hearing all the voices we need to hear? Are we reflecting carefully on scripture? Are we thinking about our theology? What is the Spirit saying to us in this time? What are other people saying to us? And how can we craft a decision that we all agree on that is going to take us ahead, even though we still feel uncomfortable and unhappy at times. So there we are. We've just had an experience of using the consensus decision-making process for making a very quick decision. Consensus doesn't always have to drag on. It can happen very quickly. And sometimes you may be surprised about how much people support a proposal, but it is also useful for us to think about how we make decisions that may take a lot longer. And sometimes those decisions might take months. The decision, for example, that High Street Road and St John's made maybe a month ago to bring their congregations together, they had to do a lot of work, a lot of listening over a long period of time and try some things out and take step by step until finally they could say, yes, this is our consensus and this is where we're going. Have you got any questions around the consensus process? What do you see as the positives or the drawbacks around consensus decision? And what do you think might be important for us to be aware of as we think about these? Can anyone suggest a strength? And then I'd like to hear someone who might have a concern about the consensus decision making.
The strength, I think, is you're getting everybody on the same page, heading in the same direction.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. Yes, I'll get my list out there. Kelly?
A strength is that sometimes you have a group of people all saying yes to something, and then that one person has extra information or a gifting in that area you might not know. So that blue card comes up and they can change the whole demeanor of the decision with a sentence. That's a really big strength.
That's right. And it's not necessarily turning the decision over, but it might be making the decision better or giving nuance or better clarity to how we're thinking. Yes. And yes.
May I add to that and agree with Kelly? That I think also my experience is often the silent or the quiet voice may have a real concern that no one else has considered because it's been bulldozed in a particular way. And sometimes what that one person says helps everyone to stop and reflect, but they've got to be heard. And you're quite right that often in a meeting situation, those people will just quietly sit there. And then later, I've had the experience where a person's come up and said, oh, I was thinking about, and you think if only they'd said that during the meeting. Well, of course, they haven't had the opportunity that this model offers.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Now, we've got Jenny and Lynette. And do you have an orange or a blue card for consensus decision making?
Is it okay to speak first?
Go, Lynette, off you go.
I guess this is a concern for people. It does assume that people have mobility skills, that they can hold cards, and there may be someone for whom that isn't an easy thing. So I just, it's a question for me about access. It's a very good method, the consensus method, but there are people that we don't consider that may not be able to do it easily.
That's true. And this doesn't replace the important skill of noticing who hasn't had an opportunity to speak and often asking, all right, so can you give us a perspective from your point of view? So that's a really important skill to have. Yeah.
Also on that, in South Australia, where I used to live, GenSec we had at the time was colourblind, and so found it quite difficult to have a meeting when couldn't actually tell the difference between the coloured cards.
That's true, yeah. And that's why we actually have blue and orange, which has got less chance of that happening than green and red traffic light approach. But blue and orange still, it might be a problem for some people. And particularly when we're online at the moment, yellow looks a bit like orange, or orange looks like yellow, so it's hard to see sometimes. Now, do you need to use consent cards? And you don't need to use cards, all right? So if you're, we have used the polls on Zoom, for example, to use this process, where we have an option for, yes, I'm warm to this, or I'm blue about this, or I've got a question or a concern. And so it's the same process, the same principles, but we just haven't got the beauty of having those cards. But you saw when we were able to look at our screens and see a wave of orange cards and 2 or 3 blue cards, they gave us an indication pretty quickly that it's okay to have a blue card. And that's part of the strength of that, I think. Yes, Kelly Skilton, we've used teddy bears. Tell us about that, Kelly.
So this is in our big larger meetings like assembly or synod. People sometimes bring around items that are just of the same color. And so someone brought a set of teddy bears, one orange, one blue, one yellow. And so we were using those, and it's the exact same effect as long as it's holding the central point, which in this, the central point is the color. So yes, you can wave anything and you forget something. So I see some people holding up like folders at the moment, and some people are holding up jumpers in the Zoom
that's
screen.
Right. That's great.
Yeah.
Now, Jenny, have you got a comment there?
I just had a couple. The first one is the opposite to what some people have been saying. It can be a huge time saver because you start hearing people and they all seem to be in agreement with
Yes.
something you think might be contentious. Like, for instance, in our church, we thought maybe the same-sex marriage might be a contentious thing. Well, everyone held up their cards and we found that everyone was for it, which was really good. And the second thing, I find our councillors, if I hand out these cards, they seem a little bit resentful. So now I've started saying to them, can I have your warm thumb up or your blue thumb down? I don't know. It's just something.
Yeah.
I think some of them think it's a bit childish. And especially as I'm a primary teacher, that probably they think I've thought it up. So, yeah, which I haven't.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's right. So we don't have to get caught up on whether we use cards or not. That's a process that we use that enables people to have a voice and for us to be able to quickly get a sense that sometimes we're actually getting a reading of the room, and sometimes we're actually deciding. All right. So, and that's why it's important to say, right, can you give me for an indication of how you're feeling? Can we give me thumbs up or thumbs down? And now, right, we've come to the point where we've really explored this. I think we're ready for a decision. Can we make a decision together? So those are the kind of points we say, are we in information time? Are we in deliberation time? Are we in decision time? So we've got Anne Schooler.
Yeah, my concern is that if you've got a very strong few people in a group, you're still going to have group pressure for people to make decisions and fall in line with what the most popular thing is.
That's true. And that's where it's actually important for us to, there's some things that we need to pay more attention to careful discernment than others. So approving the minutes is not going to require that careful discernment, unless, of course, the secretary is making things up. But the careful decision making, sometimes it's helpful to actually stop, take time out, and allow people to reflect rather than just rushing in. And one of the drawbacks of having orange and blue cards is if everyone holds up an orange card, yeah, that's fair enough. And there's no one prepared to actually step outside that. We can actually end up with groupthink, that's for sure. Faye?
We went through an example where it was assumed that we were going to accept the motion, but there could be the opposite happening, that virtually everybody puts up blue cards and then the orange ones are the ones that are stranded. And so you need to be aware that it could be going either way, not just automatically you have to accept.
Oh, that's true. That's right. And one of the tendency is if you see a wall of blue cards and maybe 10 orange cards, we assume that, well, that's not a good idea. But we do need to listen to the orange cards on that situation as well. Indeed. Yes. And then Doug?
I was going to ask, are there any particular decisions that have to be made on councils where the formal decision-making way would be a legal requirement as distinct from concession? or is it more a matter of how it's recorded in the minutes?
Traditionally, we used to say that it wasn't a decision unless there'd been a mover and a seconder and it had been done by a formal majority. So it wouldn't make it into the minutes. But in our minute taking now with in the manual for meetings, the decisions we make through this process are the normal way of operating and making decisions. So it's only when we actually need to get to a point where we've had a deadlock and we can't make a decision, but we must make a decision, that I've seen church councils say, well, okay, let's use formal process. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
I think, well, one of the biggest, you could say it could be a drawback. Some people mightn't agree, but it can take a long time sometimes to make a decision. And if you have 50-50 orange and blue for a long time and you need to do something, it can be very difficult. That's
true. And that's where the formal majority situation comes in. Where and part of that is, do we need to make a decision? And that's actually, that can be a formal process. Do we actually need to make a decision? When do we need to make a decision? So that we don't end up in a deadlock, as you say. And sometimes we actually just have to get on with it. And a bit like, I imagine the Acts 1 reading we looked at, well, that Anneke referred to, where they might have had half the people supported one apostle being appointed and half the other. And in the end, they just had to draw lots. It was really a lottery. Whereas the Council of Jerusalem, trying to work out how Jewish culture and Gentile cultures might fit into the new church, that took a long time, and they had to spend the conversation that got them somewhere. And even then, they had to review it over time. So Robin, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we've actually used this model at Ormond for probably the last 7 or 8 years. And I really think it means that the church council has to work together. And when you actually come to consensus, it actually means that you all have ownership of the decision, instead of walking away thinking, well, I didn't get, it went against the way that I wanted to go. You've actually worked through the process and you all have ownership of that decision.
Yes, that's good. And part of that's being clear when, well-crafted recommendations still need work in some cases. And so it's our responsibility together to make them better. Okay, so thank you for that, Robin. And Tom.
Duncan, it takes a bit of reorienting your thinking to operate with this consensus approach. And this session is a good training session, but do we offer training at consensus in general for chairs of church councils?
Well, I don't think we ever have in this presbytery, but from yesterday's session, it became clear that that might be a great idea. So we've only got, this is really a taster, what we're doing today, and we could spend a bit more time next year, perhaps, where we can come back and train up our chairs. And of course, people who are interested in this process, because often people won't take the chair role on because they don't feel adequately trained. Jenny and Tony?
Sometimes it's good to pray. When we're up against a difficult situation. The only trouble with prayer is that sometimes the prayer tries to enlist God to their particular point of view. But I think done properly and quietly, it allows some time to and maybe some heat to come out of arguments, because it may surprise people to know that we can get heated in church councils.
That's a great comment there, Tony. And we need to learn some new prayers, I think. And one of those prayers is a letting go prayer. I find the covenant prayer from Wesley, that's available in Uniting in Worship 2 and other places on the internet, is a wonderful prayer for church councils to pray regularly. and which really just, it's letting go of our own agenda and saying, okay, how do we do this together? And I see there's a few comments coming in. Anneke's comment is really helpful in terms of wondering about a third way to consider a deadlock, or go out on an information finding mission to see how others have dealt with similar situations or issues. So you don't actually just have to keep on hitting your head against a brick wall. And a wise person said to me once, if you find yourself hitting your head against a brick wall, stop and think, who's doing the hitting? So there are other things we can do that might help us see things in a different way. And Gary Richter says all church council needs training, and we could use this video for others. All right, so let's take that learning for us now, and we're going to apply it in terms of how we start to choose church leaders. First of all, what are you asking people to take on? And so if you're asking people to join the church council, do you have a job description or a role description or a position description for a member of the church council? And that's actually really quite important. And when the Presbytery set out earlier this year to find new members of the standing committee, that one of the first tasks for us was to write a role description for members of the standing committee. And in some cases, it wasn't just being a member of the committee, it also had a responsibility for that went with it. And in our case, some of those people would had to be the chair of another committee when they were on the standing committee. So are we asking people to carry a particular responsibility when they join the church council or other roles in the church? What kind of relationships do they need to be paying attention to? So do they have a pastoral responsibility? Do members of church council need to stay in touch with other people like the ministry team? What's the expectation around the wider church, for example? So in some cases, that role description might lay out some of those things. And time commitment. In the regulations, we say that people can choose whether they're going to spend a year on church council or 3 years or up to 5 years. So that they don't have a sense that I'm going to die in this role with my boots on. We actually have an out clause. And after 5 years or 3 years, I could actually say at that point, I'm prepared to take on another 3 years or have a break. So that's an important part of discernment for church councils, for congregations. And in that position description, if we're writing position descriptions for employees, we'll often write a list of competencies or abilities that we're looking for, and a range of experiences, and not just people who've been around a long time, but people who have been in different places. Maybe they bring the experience of being a member of a different generation or a different cultural group or a different church somewhere else. Maybe they have been outside the church quite a bit and are able to bring their experience to that. So this is trying to avoid that sense that the people who spend the most time in the church in its business end up on church council. Well, we want to be open at the edges as well as committed at the core. And then that sense of wisdom. What are the different elements of wisdom that we're calling for in our church council or in our elders? And finally, maybe most important, is that sense of God's calling. What is a sense of the person's discernment of their own calling to this role? What is their sense of humbly recognizing that God may have gifted them in different ways, and what can they bring because God is calling them? And these are areas that you can put in your position description, but also in the way that people write about themselves. And this avoids just giving a list of all the church committees you've been on and all the working bees you attended. This is actually helping us to discern more deeply about our calling. So you might want to write a nomination form that has some of these things in it. And then having the time to listen and to reflect. When the Standing Committee for Presbytery was calling for a wider range of people to be involved in leading the Presbytery, from different cultural groups, from different age groups, making sure we have men and women, ordained and lay, we needed to ensure that people had a chance to reflect on this. And so we asked a group of 3 people, Kelly and Anne and Mary, to spend time with people, listening and reflecting with them. And that may be something we can offer in our own congregations, that you might have a person who sits with people to reflect on their sense of call. Often people have that sense of imposter syndrome, that maybe I've got nothing to offer really, and if people really knew how inadequate my prayer life was, they wouldn't ask me. But there's a sense in which we invite people to reflect, and that's part of the encouragement that we offer. The other thing is that we encourage congregations, I think the regulations actually require it, that we give the names of people who are being nominated to the congregation 2 weeks before we decide. So not just names, but the ways in which people have reflected on their calling. We all have a part in discernment. The members of the congregation have a part in discernment. So rather than having, okay, these are the 5 people we're voting on today, put your vote in, and depending on how well you know those people, you get a vote that way. This is actually giving a much deeper opportunity for discernment. And finally, we do need to choose people. Even if you have 5 vacancies and you have 5 people putting their hands up, they still need to be elected on church council. So you actually have to have a process that says we choose these people, particularly each person. And there are some situations where you might have 5 people and one of those people you're not sure about. So the congregation needs to have an opportunity to take that discernment. And then finally commissioning those people so that they are recognised and empowered to be the church council. And when we bring new people in, it's a good opportunity to commission the whole church council if you can. And I'll put down the bottom there, thanking and discharging. So people who are finishing on church council, rather than just disappearing back into the congregation, let's thank them and send them into their new life, not on church council. Any comments or questions about that part of the process, about how we choose church council members? I'm sure there's a lot that you're going to ask about here. Alison.
I know some of the members of our breakout room said how difficult it is for them to even get church councillors because of the ageing of the churches. And I think sometimes that's a bigger issue for all of us going forwards.
Yes. And that may mean that we have to be flexible in the way we operate our church council. Sometimes I know of some church councils where they take a break by having a change. So I'll be the secretary and you could be the treasurer now, and get a bit of variety. Or they might find people who can provide the treasurer role from a neighbouring congregation, finding ways of supporting each other locally. Any other thoughts on that?
I know sometimes the roles might feel too large. So at Murrumbina, we know, I can't remember, it was suggested that our secretary role is actually split in 2. So we have a minutes taker and a correspondence. So then those roles actually became feasible for someone to do as well as work.
Yes. And the same thing applies for a treasurer and a team. I think we mentioned that last time, but you might have a treasurer and a couple of people working alongside them. One is a bookkeeper and one person who does the banking, for example. Any other thoughts, Rhonda? And yep.
Some parishes either hire a treasurer from outside, or you can even get Synod to do the treasurer's role. I think it's about $40 an hour that Synod charges to do the treasurer's role. That's one way of getting around. The treasurer seems to be the position that requires particular expertise that may not be present, but even there are ways of working around it and dividing it up into accounts payable person and someone else who does the simple bookkeeping side, and you can have, like it was said, a committee who cover that, or if that even isn't possible, just outsource it.
Yep, those are great ideas indeed. Ross?
A couple of things. First of all, I'd support all about the treasurer role. We looked at trying to create an assistant treasurer position and looked at someone who'd recently completed some accounting work, recognising also you've got to look at supporting the person as they might get older or there are health issues or whatever. And I think that those things have to be taken into account too. It's one of the reasons personally I've found having a church council executive is really important, just to oversee and to anticipate those things. The other thing is about using the church council to use people within the congregation to search out people who've never nominated for anything, who have particular gifts or skills, or younger people, so that you're kind of spreading out. And I think that requires, the thing I've learned is you can't just put a note in the notice sheet, if you're interested, please talk. That's not going to work. You've got to kind of get out there and, I won't say sell it, but talk to people and say, you should consider this. And having been in that position, I think we can't underestimate that. That's so important to kind of support people.
Indeed, yes. See the beauty of being asked. Alison?
I agree entirely with what's just been said. That's what I was going to say. I think the personal approach to someone is very important as an encouragement for them to consider standing as a candidate for the church council. And it's a bit of discernment on the point of those who are already part of the council to find people that we think would be suitable, and also a variety of people, so that we don't finish up with all old people like me, or we have a variety from different cultures. So
Indeed,
that personal approach, I think, is very important.
Yes, that's helpful. And as a presbytery, we in February, we agreed that we wanted to ensure that we had a gender mix on our committees, and we wanted to ensure that we had a mix of people of different ages and different cultures. And that just doesn't happen automatically. You actually have to be proactive about that. And I wonder if Mary or Kelly might want to comment on what they saw in that process. Yes, Mary.
I think it takes quite a while. I think that there are, but I think to go on doing the asking just alerts people to, there's other people who see their gifts as being really useful, and they might think in the future how they could, offer that assistance that they might not be able to at the time that you ask them. So I think it can be a longer process than perhaps sometimes you hope.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Mary, to realise that these discernment processes for individuals might take some time, and they need to get a sense of more confidence, or it might be just the finding the right time in their lives when they have the freedom to contribute the time commitment. Yes. Jill, I think.
Has anyone had the experience of someone nominating who's not really appropriate?
It happens all the time, Jill. Yes.
And how would you suggest that this is handled when there's a shortage of other people?
Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
What is inappropriate? If we are open and we are discerning what is inappropriate, everybody's opinion should be counted. I don't think anyone is inappropriate. I think that's a bad terminology.
I think the beauty of having a well-constructed nomination form that invites people to reflect on what they are thinking about and what they might bring, it makes it very clear to people that they have the opportunity to discern, is this the right person? And helping the congregation be aware that we do not have to fill every position. So that just because we've got 8 people nominating for 8 positions doesn't mean we actually just say, well, that's it. We actually, there's the significant part of choosing, electing members of the church council that is the responsibility of the congregation. So part of that, it's educating a congregation to discern. But the other one is to be able to sit down with someone and talk it through with them in terms of, all right, so what's happening here? What do you see as important in your role? And it may become clear that yes, they have to think again. Yes, so that's sometimes courageous conversations need to happen, and that might be in the case of people who demonstrate bullying behavior, or people who have a history of activity that makes it very, very difficult for them to be trusted. I mean, I think, Julie, that there are some situations where we know something about a person that makes it very difficult to put them in a position of leadership.
Okay, I did, thanks, Duncan. I did just, I think that the word inappropriate was just a rather harsh word to be using.
Yeah, well, I could think of harsher words.
Yes, possibly.
Yeah. So, for example, the United Church has a policy around persons of concern, where people who have a history of sexual abuse, of a conviction, are not allowed to exercise leadership positions in the United Church. And the Church Council actually has to have a process of monitoring their involvement in the congregation. So yes, that's, if they are nominated for Church Council, we would have to say, I'm sorry, you cannot be a member of Church Council. So there are some situations where we the congregation has some boundaries.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Jill.
Yeah.
I'll try and think of another word.
Yes. All right. Well, that's a good challenge for us. But it's helpful for the congregation to know these things, that they actually have a responsibility for discernment. And the Church Council, I think you need to have at least an executive who are clear about that. I know some congregations say you need to be a member of the congregation for a year before you can stand on Church Council, so we can see how you operate, because we sometimes get people who, the Code of Ethics workshop we had on grooming yesterday and Wednesday, we know that there are people who move around congregations looking for a soft touch, where they can actually find a way of winning the trust of the congregation and then ending up in an abusive situation. And we actually need to know people, rather than just say, well, you're young, you're capable, we'll put you on Church Council. Yep, these things can actually protect us from very sad situations where we have to remove people from Church Council, even though it may be frustrating. All right, so any questions for us in terms of anything else? All right, so Wendy's asking, what about cultural differences in nomination processes where Koreans, for example, lose face if they lose an election? So in the Korean Presbytery, New South Wales ACT, the council members nominated who they thought should be the chair, no nominations, and the person who the majority voted in was invited to the chair. So yes, that's another way of operating. Yep. So there's all kinds of ways in which we protect the sense of well-being of the people in the process And that sometimes people won't put their name up because they're afraid that they may not be voted in. There's the imposter syndrome where people feel as though, well, if only they knew what I was really like, they wouldn't put me in there. Janice, and then Alison.
I just wanted to check if people are not communicant members, are they not allowed to be on church council? Is that a rule?
The general sense is that church council members or associate members of the church. So you could be a member of the Anglican Church and then become an associate member for this congregation. That's why it's worth actually every year asking, so are there people who would like to formally become members of the church? And I think we overlook that sometimes. To actually have a process where we actually say, yes, I am a member. And the other one is that people can be co-opted. Church councils can co-opt 2 members or 2 people onto church council. And I'm not sure that they have to be members. I'll have to check the regulations on that.
Excuse me, Duncan.
Yes.
That thing about the 1 year, I thought that was a blanket rule in the Uniting Church, because that's what we've been running with, that it was not our, it wasn't our choice that it was 1 year, it was just the way it was.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the last time I had a conversation about it was that it was to do with Safe Church. The idea being that it would be an opportunity for the church to get to know someone and discern whether there was any concerns or any problems that, putting someone immediately into a position of authority might pose.
Yes.
So,
it's actually a policy rather than a regulation. Yes. So that's helpful to recognise that the Assembly has nationwide regulations that apply to every Uniting Church, and then we have policies which are often introduced by synods to be carried out, and we have a number of policies that are now becoming national around safety of children. So it's worth noting that, and you'll see that in the resources there are some policies around Safe Church that apply to church councils.
You've talked about having discernment about getting people onto the church council.
Yes.
What about church councillors that are perhaps life members and we can't get them on?
All right. Okay.
As carrying over from the Presbyterian Church.
Yes, indeed. I think we mentioned this last time, that if a person has been an elder in that particular congregation since a union, that the regulations at the time said that they have life tenure as an elder. Now, and normally they would be on church council, but the church council and the congregation as a meeting can change the understanding of how church council is formed, and the Presbytery, the Pastoral Relations Committee, can approve any variation. And that was actually made clear in the revision of the regulations back in 2008. And now there are very few people in that situation. So the regulations have been thinned down a bit on this. But how
does the church council change? Do they say not all elders are church councillors? Or?
That's right. So basically, what we're moving towards is the people on church council are the people who have been elected by the congregation for a particular term, up to 5 years at a time. And if you want to have a variation from people with life tenure who have been on that church council since 1977, then you would need to address that as a congregation and say, this is how we understand how we appoint the church council. We have a variation. If a person has moved from one congregation to another since the union, the regulations in 2008 made it very clear, actually 1999 I think it was, made it very clear that that person now has to go through the same process of nomination and election as anybody else. even though they were an elder at union. So it only applies to people who have been in the same congregation on the same church council without any breaks since 1977. There we are. That's you heard it here. But if you want to, if church councils want to follow that through, the Presbytery is only too happy to work with you on a process to explore any development or variation on how you run your church council. Yes. Yes, David asks, in what circumstances would small congregations have all the members form the church council? And in the regulations, if you have members, 30 members or less, you can decide that the whole congregation becomes the church council. And of course, you might want to have an executive. You would need to have an executive still. That doesn't mean you don't have a chair and a secretary and a treasurer. But you could say, well, when the congregation has a special meeting, you put on a different hat. You are now all members of the church council. So that's how that works. So you might say, well, we're going to have after worship on the 11th of November, St. Samples congregation becomes St. Samples Church Council, and we will make these decisions together. It's not great for 30 people, I tell you. I've been in places where trying to make a decision with 30 people, the kind of complexity that you're going to have to deal with and the quick decision making. If you've got a congregation of 12, that makes sense. Yeah. All right. So that's my comments on that. That's my personal comments from watching those congregations operate that way. And I love that comment from Anneke earlier. If you're hitting a brick wall, it may be an invitation from the Spirit to start moving in another direction. All right, so Fiona, you've got a question or a comment?
Yes, I've got a question. Back in the first session, we talked about the opportunity for the council to co-opt 1 or 2 members.
Yes.
So I was wondering now, looking at this consensus approach, does that need to be conducted as a consensus? So the council need to discuss that and who they want to co-opt, and the card system is used there. And then also does that then need to go to the congregation? Do we need to do a role description and get that person to write about their calling if we are wanting to co-opt people to council for whatever duration?
Yeah, so co-opting and electing are 2 different things. So the church council as a whole, I would think, would be wise to have some consensus among them who should be there rather than just a captain's pick from the chairperson. But in this case, it doesn't have to go to the congregation for election. So that's the nature of co-option. We could say, well, look, we need someone with some financial skills to come and join the church council. Let's approach this person, or we need to ensure that we've got some younger voices. I had a conversation with a minister this week who said they've always had men on church council. How do we get women on church council when the congregation won't vote them on? While the church council could actually co-opt 2 women and they might start getting used to it. Yeah. Yes, I think that's a wise thing, but I think it's important also to be transparent so that the congregation knows, yes, the church council has chosen these 2 people to be there, and it may be an opportunity for 2 people to try out being on church council. Some of our younger members who don't want to go through the process of being elected because it's a big commitment for 5 years. They don't know where they'll be, but yep, that's a good thought.
Okay, thank you.
Not many people want to be in the council. What about the pat on the shoulders approach? Yes, and that's a great idea. So approaching people and inviting them to reflect on this, particularly when you have you've done a skills analysis or an experience analysis or a wisdom analysis for your church council, and you're thinking, we need some people with these particular areas. Why don't we go and ask that person to consider being on a church council? Yep. So I think that's a responsibility for the whole congregation to think about. And when we open up the nominations for the congregation, to encourage members to look at the position description and say, who do you know that could experience this or approach this? Sandra says, when there are so few people to choose from, how do we deal with burnout or feelings that I have to stay because there is no one else? And I think we talked about this a bit last time too, didn't we? Where we have a challenge of, you've only got 3 or 4 people who have the skills of running a church council, and maybe another 3 or 4 who are there to support. And I've seen some situations where the idea change is as good as a rest. And I think St. John's Alston Week might be an example of that. Okay, I'll be the treasurer this time, you can be the secretary. That's one way of approaching it. But the other, the model might be looking at what are the high demand responsibilities that we might need to bring somebody else in, or to farm out to somebody else. And the treasurer is a classic example. It's a really demanding role, particularly now that we have to think about all kinds of things around taxation and compliance. And a number of congregations use Synod's bookkeeping services, so that's an option. And the other option is to think regionally. So you might find a cluster of 3 or 4 congregations who are able to have one treasurer for the 3 congregations, particularly smaller congregations, so that you've got the resources that you're sharing. Gary says, using the consensus model in a safe, accepting environment and more than just business agenda church council can be very rewarding, that's for sure. Jay, have you got a comment?
I have, and that's coming a little bit from what Sunny was saying in the chat there, around being aware of different cultures don't always work really well with elections and being nominated. And the possibility of not being elected. So we just need to be very aware of the different cultures, as our churches are differently made up. But that idea of patting someone on the shoulder is always a good one.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. Any other comments or questions?
Duncan, I like the idea of actually coming up with the position description of a church council member, and then using that to help focus what we do as a church council. So, we come up with a position description, not simply to snare somebody to get into the post, but also to reflect on whether whether our focus as a church council is actually sufficiently narrow, or whether we are going beyond our what we asked people to do. And so, yes, sort of helping to use it in both directions, as it were.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, and it helps maybe in your reporting to the congregation through the year as well. This is what we're about. This is what we're called to do. David?
Yeah, you were talking before about using sort of synods support for financial accounting and things like that. For positions like that, would you necessarily have to have somebody who is a member of the church to do the accounts? Or if we happen to know somebody who is an accountant who's willing to spend time looking after our accounts, is it acceptable to use people from outside the church to do those sort of things?
Yes, that's for certain, particularly around bookkeeping. It's helpful to have a member of the church council who is either a member or associate member, who is able to carry the responsibility for talking with the congregation and about where things are at financially, and be able to ensure that there's a budget and so on. But yes, a lot of congregations like Mulgrave, we just see there in the chat, they pay a bookkeeper to assist the treasurer. So someone who's familiar with Mind Your Own Business, MyOb, or other packages like that, or who are able to help with getting the financial returns in and so on. That's actually really helpful. That person doesn't have to be a member of the church. Yep, the people in the room do shape the decision making, though. That's the point to remember. It's not just about voting, but you don't have to have all your property and finance legwork on the church council. It can be happening elsewhere, but the important thing is that church council knows what's going on and are really well informed.
My comment is that we have to be sure we don't let position descriptions be limiting on people's contributions.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to say more about that?
Well, there's sometimes a tendency for people to say, this is outside I'm not interested, this is outside my position description. So position descriptions need to be worked out, but not be used to limit the way people think about their contribution to the church council.
That's true. And so that's part of the benefit of having a well-crafted role description, which talks about the whole role of discernment for the church council and the responsibility. We talked earlier on last 2 weeks ago about the behaviour covenant and the code of conduct, and there's quite a few other areas in the regulations. The responsibilities for the church council are quite broad. What if you have someone who's on church council and you're not sure that you want them there still? That was a question we had yesterday. How do you handle that when we've got someone who's struggling with, who might be a bully, or who might be a person who makes a point of actually stopping everything happening that the church council wants to do? Have you got any thoughts about that, anybody?
Yeah, Duncan, presumably, one of the basis on which all people are elected is through a secret ballot. So potentially, if people felt quite strongly that this was a disruptive member of the council, one might assume that the rest of the people wouldn't vote for that person, and therefore that person wouldn't be elected.
All right.
Yeah.
Yep, that's helpful. Yep. So that's the importance of anonymous voting, indeed. Gary, and then Peter.
Just a quick question about the secret ballot. That has to wait until their term expires.
Yes.
And how do you let the congregation know so that they can make an informed decision? I think we need to go to a lot more pastoral care approach, and it may fall to the chair to talk with the person about their role in the meeting.
Indeed.
Maybe suggest a role that uses their talents for seeing the other side of things to better effect.
Wonderful reflection there, Gary. Thank you for that. And Tony or Jenny, and then Peter.
I'm just agreeing with that. And sometimes it takes a while. On church councils that I've been involved in, it may take quite a while. But if somebody is being disruptive in a church council, it's often because there are reasons, and we need to gently find out what those reasons are. The other thing is that you may be encouraging people to leave because it's too much for them, and that's the other way yeah.
Yep, that's helpful. Thank you for that, Tony. And Peter, this is the final comment now.
Oh, sure. I agree with the two previous comments, but I think having courageous conversations and knowing that the boundaries will hold is particularly important. The Quakers call this plain speak.
That's very good. And being careful about the setting in which you have those conversations, as we talked about last time, where that there was no shame associated with these conversations. All right, so just a reminder that we've talked about discernment. That's a role of the Church Council. It's a reminder of the people of God. So the Church Council holds that within the congregation. And we've talked about the commitment as the Uniting Church to doing that discernment together and to move together as much as we can. And we've talked just now about how we choose people who will be able to enter into that spirit and are able to work together. And so we're moving now to Jay, being able to reflect with us as we finish our meeting today.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. And thank you, everyone, for your conversation and your thoughts and your interaction. It's an interesting thing to sit back and theologically reflect on all the words and the comments and the themes that have come up. And I think Anneke began us in a beautiful space as we sat through this idea of discernment, with God being in mind, with Christ being at the centre, and that all of us are open to the Spirit. And as I listened, that's what I heard. I heard the voice coming through in so many spaces in everything that we spoke about. I think of Elijah and that still small voice up on the mountainside and listening intently for God, and God being in the quietness, in the deepness. And those voices that we talked about involvement and being open to different voices speaking to us at time, that all have validity and weight and content to give to us, be they young or be they very old, be they flowers or be they checks, whichever one it may be, to hear and listen and react and respond to the voices was really, I think, what I heard importantly through all that we said today. And I think with those voices too is that we need to stop and listen to the voices that are challenging us, so that the voices that may differ from where we believe we are or what we are thinking, because that opens us up. And that's how we work together and listen and discern and come to decisions. And I think of Moses, who in the conversation with God at the burning bush said, don't listen to me, I can't speak. But God sees inside us deeper. Same with King David, as he was the one eventually to be anointed. It's that discernment of listening, deep listening, that I think all of these conversations are so important as we make our decisions. So I want you to go away remembering that we are called to listen, called to connect with each other deeply, and to look through the facade perhaps, but to listen deeply. And they're the things I've heard from us as we've spoken today.
Thank you very much, Jay. We've come to 11:30, and as a Presbytery team and with Jay's support and others, we want to say thank you for participating in this learning community, and we're looking forward to continuing over the next year or so to be not just an institution or organization, but a community of learning. And we're looking for people who would like to be part of stimulating further learning. And Kelly, put your hand up there. Kelly's developing a network of people who will be able to foster more of these learning opportunities across the Presbytery, and you'll be able to see more about that. Thank you very much, everybody, and we hope that your day goes well. And some of you will see at 4:30 this afternoon to talk about the re-emergence of the church in this time of eased restrictions.